The sunlit terminal of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport bustled with the usual symphony of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and half-finished coffee cups. Among the ebb and flow of business travelers and vacationers stood Eli Thompson, an 8-year-old boy clutching a backpack nearly half his size. His pressed navy blazer, crisp white button-up, and neatly laced sneakers didn't draw much attention. But if anyone had looked closely, they'd have noticed something rare, a quiet confidence that came not from entitlement, but from being raised with purpose. Eli's eyes sparkled as he watched planes taxi across the tarmac. He loved flying, not for the luxury or even the destination, but for the feeling of limitless possibility when the wheels lifted off the ground. Today, that excitement shimmered just beneath his calm demeanor. He was flying alone for the first time. His father, Donovan Thompson, had sent a last-minute message. Running behind. Go ahead and board. Seat 2A is yours. I'll meet you in the air. What Eli didn't know, what no one boarding Flight 227 to Chicago knew, was that this journey would not go as planned, and that a single seat assignment would ignite a chain reaction that no passenger, no airline executive, no PR team could ever undo. When pre-boarding for first class began, Eli stood patiently in line, his posture straight. He handed over his ticket without fanfare. The gate agent, surprised but professional, scanned the boarding pass and smiled. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Thompson. Enjoy your flight." He nodded politely and walked toward the jet bridge, past towering adults who gave him passing glances, some amused, some puzzled, some barely noticing him at all. Eli moved down the plush carpet of first class until he reached seat 2A, a window seat with sweeping views of the wing and clouds beyond. He slid his backpack under the seat, pulled out a book about galaxies, and settled in with ease. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. Just minutes later, the unmistakable clack of high heels pierced the quiet cabin. A tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a power suit that screamed Manhattan Executive paused mid-step at the aisle. Her name was Victoria Camden, senior brand strategist for a global fashion label. She was known in boardrooms for her cutting insight and zero tolerance for inefficiency. But what she was less known for, at least professionally, was her deeply rooted contempt for those she believed didn't fit. She glanced at the seat indicator. 2B. Then her eyes fell on Eli. At first, she blinked, confused. Then, as the realization settled, her lips pressed into a thin, hostile line. "This can't be right," she muttered, adjusting her sunglasses atop her head. She turned to the nearby flight attendant. Jordan, a young man in his early 30s, polished, polite, and alert. "I think there's a problem," Victoria said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind that signaled years of privilege. "I specifically requested a seat away from children." Jordan checked her ticket. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 2B. That's right beside Mr. Thompson here." She leaned in. "Are you certain that's his seat?" Eli didn't move. He didn't speak, but he heard every syllable. "I mean, no offense, but he looks like he belongs in coach, not beside me." Jordan held back a wince. "His ticket was confirmed through our elite partner program. He's a legitimate first-class passenger." Victoria scoffed. "Seriously? There must be some mistake. I paid full fare for first class, and this is supposed to be a professional environment, not daycare." Jordan's professionalism didn't crack. "I understand your concern, ma'am, But the flight is full. There are no alternate seats. With an exaggerated sigh, Victoria stepped past him and tossed her designer tote into the overhead bin. She dropped into 2B like it was a punishment, crossing her legs sharply and turning her body away from Eli as though physical proximity might infect her. Eli turned back to his book. His fingers gripped the pages tightly. After a moment of silence, he turned slightly and said softly, "Hi, I'm Eli. Nice to meet you." Victoria didn't even glance at him. Instead, she pulled out her phone and dialed. "Brenda, you won't believe who they sat me next to," she said, her voice just loud enough for others to hear. "Some child. And yes, black. I swear to you, I feel like I've been pranked. This is first class, for God's sake, not a charity program." Passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman in 3A looked up from her Kindle. The words had cut the air like a knife. Eli stayed silent. His eyes were fixed on the words in his book, but none of them registered anymore. Jordan returned with drinks. "Would you like apple juice, Mr. Thompson?" "Yes, please." "Thank you." Victoria held up her hand. "Nothing for me. Just a quiet flight. If that's even possible anymore." When Jordan moved on, she muttered under her breath, "I don't care whose kid you are. You don't belong here." That's when she noticed the man boarding late. A tall, sharply dressed black man in his mid-40s, commanding in presence, calm in expression. He took his seat just one row behind. She didn't recognize him. Not yet. And that would be her greatest mistake, because she had just insulted, humiliated, and would soon strike the child of a man whose reach extended far beyond this plain cabin. And the skies were about to get turbulent, for reasons that had nothing to do with weather. The plane had taken off smoothly, but for Eli Thompson, the cabin air felt heavier with every passing minute. He sat quietly in seat 2A, back straight, book open on his lap, the apple juice on his tray untouched. Across from him, Victoria Camden was locked in a battle with her own discomfort, exaggerated huffs escaping her lips every time Eli moved, even slightly. The contrast between the two passengers was striking. Eli, at just 8 years old, exuded a calm maturity rare for his age. Victoria, a seasoned executive, exuded control. Except now, control was slipping from her grasp. "Do you have to fidget so much?" she snapped suddenly, as Eli shifted slightly to adjust his seatbelt. He blinked, startled. "Sorry, ma'am. That's not how you sit in first class," she muttered, half under her breath, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You sit still. You don't make noise. You don't make others uncomfortable." The man seated behind them, Donovan Thompson, Eli's father, looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. He'd boarded late, taken his seat in 3A quietly, and observed. Now, his body went still. Eli nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria crossed her legs sharply, sighing. She retrieved a sleek laptop from her bag and began tapping away, ignoring the child beside her. Flight attendant Jordan passed through the cabin again, this time with a tray of warm towels. "Would you like one, Mr. Thompson?" he asked kindly, kneeling slightly to Eli's level. "Yes, please," Eli replied, his voice polite. When Jordan handed him the towel, Victoria turned. "You're really doing this service for a kid?" Jordan paused. "Mr. Thompson is a first-class guest. We provide this service to everyone in this section, ma'am." Victoria gave a tight, fake smile. "Of course." But as Jordan walked away, she leaned slightly toward Eli. "You know, I spent years working to afford this kind of travel. It's not meant for anyone. It's meant for people who earn it. I worked hard in school, Eli said softly. That's why my dad bought me this ticket. Victoria scoffed. You mean your dad bought it? That's not the same thing as earning it. Eli said nothing. He turned back to his book. The pages were starting to blur, not from tears, but from the growing ache in his chest. A few rows back, a woman in 4D whispered to her husband. Did she just say that out loud? The husband nodded grimly. Victoria pulled out a luxury skincare kit and began her in-flight ritual with swift, clinical precision. As she dabbed cream beneath her eyes, turbulence struck. The cabin jolted. Eli's apple juice slid, toppling. Most of it spilled on his tray, but a few drops splashed onto Victoria's beige silk sleeve. Her reaction was volcanic. You little, she snapped, her voice raised now. Do you know how much this blouse costs? I'm sorry, Eli said, panicked, grabbing the napkin to help. Don't touch me, she hissed, recoiling. Eli froze. The outburst had turned heads. Jordan returned immediately, eyes flicking from Victoria's expression to Eli's stricken face. Everything all right here? He asked. This child just spilled juice on me, she snarled. I want to be moved. Now. I'm afraid we're at full capacity, ma'am, Jordan replied. I don't care. I want him away from me. He's a minor traveling with his guardian, Jordan said carefully. We can't separate him unless there's a safety issue. I am saying this is a safety issue, she barked. Emotional safety matters too. Jordan hesitated. Unless there's physical aggression or danger, we can't justify relocation, ma'am. Oh, for God's sake, she muttered, turning her back to both of them. Donovan watched it all. Still seated in 3A, he didn't intervene. Yet. He wanted to give the flight crew room to respond. He knew how quickly things escalated when power was misused. But every fiber of him was tightening. Watching your son get humiliated, bit by bit, was a unique, surgical kind of pain. The minutes dragged on. Eli wiped his tray meticulously. He whispered a thank you when Jordan brought him another juice, this time with a lid. Victoria, meanwhile, ordered champagne. Something strong, she said. I need to calm down. The tension was now a third passenger between them. Eli clutched his book, holding it like a shield. He didn't cry, but he stopped looking out the window. Then Victoria leaned in one last time. You know what's really wrong with this picture? She said, in a low, venomous tone. You don't belong in first class. Not with that skin. Not with that name. You're an exception, and you know it. It was said so quietly that only Eli, and maybe the woman seated in 1D, heard it. But the poison in those words struck with surgical accuracy. Eli's voice trembled when he whispered, I didn't do anything to you. You exist, she snapped. That's enough. That was the final straw. Donovan stood up. Every passenger within earshot looked up. The man from 3A, tall, calm, commanding, stepped into the aisle. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried. You just made a terrible mistake. Victoria turned to face him, confusion morphing into horror as recognition bloomed. The face she'd seen on business magazine covers. The name whispered in corporate circles. Donovan Thompson, billionaire tech innovator, philanthropist, and one of the most respected black CEOs in America. You're his? I'm his father, Donovan said evenly. And you've spent the last hour spewing hatred toward my child, thinking no one important was listening. The silence in the cabin was electric. Flight attendant, Donovan called. Jordan appeared instantly. I'd like to speak with your captain and the air marshal on board. Immediately. Victoria went pale. And Eli? He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just breathed, for the first time in an hour, knowing someone finally stood beside him. The cabin air suddenly felt thicker, like it had registered the shift in energy just as acutely as the people in row 2. Victoria turned around, face paling slightly as she registered the tall, broad-shouldered man who had just spoken. Donovan Thompson wasn't just standing, he was commanding. His 6'3" frame rose with the silent authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. His tailored blazer, neat beard, and poised calm spoke louder than her smugness ever could. Eli turned toward the voice, relief washing over his small face. Dad. That single word said everything. Donovan gave his son a nod, calm, steady, full of unspoken reassurance, before shifting his gaze back to the woman whose words had soured an entire section of first class. I've been listening, Donovan said evenly. Every word, every tone, every insult you thought wouldn't be challenged. Victoria's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Around them, passengers had begun to take notice. Seatbacks tilted subtly, heads turned. There was no shouting, no theatrics, but eyes were now on her. Finally. I suggest you stand up and apologize to my son, Donovan continued. His voice was soft, measured, the kind that left no room for debate. He has done nothing wrong, and everything you've done, you'll answer for that. Victoria blinked rapidly. I wasn't aware he was your... That's the point, Donovan cut in. You didn't care whose child he was. You saw a black boy alone in first class, and that was enough for you to decide he didn't belong. Her eyes darted to the flight attendants, now watching nearby. She tried to compose herself, but her tone betrayed her desperation. Look, this has been blown way out of proportion. No, said a voice behind Donovan. It was the woman from seat 1D. No, it hasn't. Victoria turned, stunned. I heard everything too, the woman said, removing her sunglasses. You spoke to that child with nothing but contempt. And when you thought no one was listening, you became cruel. Another voice followed, from the aisle across. You told him people like him didn't belong. And now, the businessman from 3C added, you're trying to rewrite the story because his father just stood up. The murmurs grew. Strangers who hadn't spoken a word since takeoff were now adding their voices to the reckoning. The quiet ripple of solidarity was louder than any protest. Victoria's face flushed red. Donovan hadn't moved. He didn't need to. The truth had already done the work. Eli sat silent, his father's hand resting lightly on his shoulder now. That hand, steady, strong, reminded him that no matter how invisible the world tried to make him feel, he was seen. And more than that, he was protected. I'll file a complaint, Victoria muttered. This is harassment. You can file whatever you want, said Jordan, the flight attendant, stepping forward now with visible resolve. But I've documented every report from passengers about your conduct, and there is an air marshal on board. That caught her attention. This isn't just about rude words anymore, Jordan continued. It's about the way you've made multiple passengers uncomfortable, including a child, including a minor. Victoria tried to protest, but James, the senior attendant, stepped beside Jordan now. Ma'am, he said, in that same firm tone used to control disruptions at 30,000 feet. We'll need to relocate you. The captain has been informed. No, she snapped. I paid for this seat. And that child paid to be treated like a human being. James said, without missing a beat. The quiet gasp from nearby passengers wasn't shock. It was vindication. Donovan leaned in now, voice still low enough to remain between them. You thought you could say anything and walk away. You thought your voice was louder than his. He nodded toward his son. But you didn't realize the seat behind you was louder than you think. As Victoria sat frozen in disbelief, James motioned toward another flight attendant. Together, they began gathering her belongings. She made one final attempt to salvage pride, adjusting her scarf, brushing non-existent crumbs from her lap, but it was hollow. The businessman in 3C leaned over as she passed. You might want to update your resume, he said flatly, because it's going viral before we land. Victoria flinched. Donovan remained beside Eli, speaking only to him now. You handled that better than most grown men would have. I didn't want to make it worse, Eli murmured. You didn't, his father replied. You made it clear. As Victoria was relocated to the back of the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't celebration. This wasn't about victory. It was about validation. People saw what happened. People said something. And for once, the consequences followed quickly. Jordan returned with a glass of water for Donovan and a fresh tray for Eli. I'm sorry this happened, he said, kneeling briefly at eye level with the boy. You didn't deserve any of it. Thank you, Eli said, voice steady now. Jordan turned to Donovan. Sir, the captain has asked to speak with you after landing. We're filing an official incident report. Donovan nodded. We'll cooperate fully. By now, phones had been tucked away, heads turned back forward, and conversations resumed. More subdued now, more thoughtful. The rest of the flight was quiet. But in that silence, something had shifted. Eli leaned against the window again, but this time his posture had changed. Shoulders back, chin up. He hadn't just survived a moment of racial prejudice. He had outshone it. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can say is to stay seated and let the truth rise behind you. As the flight began its slow descent into Denver International Airport, there was a weight in the air heavier than the altitude drop could explain. It wasn't turbulence that stirred unease through the first-class cabin. It was reckoning, an invisible, undeniable shift in power and perception that settled over every passenger who had witnessed what happened in row 2. Eli remained quiet beside his father, his fingers wrapped around the final pages of his book, though his eyes weren't moving. He was pretending to read, but he was replaying the moment over and over. The words, the slap of a suitcase as it hit the overhead bin, the sliver of cold in Victoria's voice every time she spoke to him. And then, the shift, the low rumble of his father's voice breaking through that silence, steady as gravity. Donovan hadn't said much since the confrontation. He didn't need to. The cabin said it all. Across the aisle, whispers continued like wind over dry grass. Phones buzzed on airplane mode, preloaded drafts of what passengers would soon post. Clips, quotes, photos, thoughts hastily typed in notes apps. White woman harasses. Black kid in first class. Doesn't know his billionaire father is sitting right behind her. It wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a storm waiting on the tarmac. Near the front galley, Jordan and James huddled with the lead purser and the air marshal, an unassuming man in his 40s, clean-cut and quiet, now scrolling through witness statements on a tablet. He looked up occasionally, eyes scanning the cabin, his gaze often landing on Victoria Mercer, now seated in business class, her lips pressed in a rigid line, her shoulders pulled so tight they nearly reached her ears. She was no longer the composed executive who demanded champagne and proximity to power. She was a headline waiting to break. The air marshal approached Donovan quietly. "Mr. Thompson, I just want to confirm that we'll be detaining the passenger at gate arrival. Local law enforcement will be meeting the plane." Donovan nodded. "Good. She assaulted my son. She degraded him. And she did it without shame. I've spoken to 5 passengers who corroborated the incident," the marshal added. 2 have video. We'll need you to give a formal statement as well." Eli looked up. "Am I going to have to talk to police?" "Only if you want to," the marshal said gently. "But we've got enough evidence without making you relive it again." "I can do it," Eli said after a pause. "I want to." Donovan gave his son a glance filled with quiet admiration. "You've always had more courage than most grown men," he said. As the captain announced final descent, passengers were asked to return seats and tray tables to their upright positions. But no one was thinking about seat belts or safety protocols anymore. All eyes were locked on what would happen when wheels hit the ground. This wasn't a story they could leave at cruising altitude. Victoria sat rigidly in her reassigned seat, her phone clutched tightly in both hands. Messages had started pouring in as soon as Wi-Fi flickered back online. 2 missed calls from her assistant, 1 from HR, a flood of texts from colleagues. But the one that mattered, the one from her CEO, was just 5 words long. "Call me. Now urgent." Her stomach dropped. Her hand shook. Behind her, a flight attendant whispered into the intercom phone, "She's still seated in 14A. We'll need a quiet escort, but make it firm." The captain's voice came overhead again. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we taxi to the gate, we ask that you remain seated. Law enforcement personnel will be boarding shortly to assist with a passenger matter. We appreciate your cooperation." The cabin gasped, some subtle, others not. The man in 3C let out a long breath. "She really did it to herself?" someone whispered. "No seat upgrade can fix this," another muttered. The aircraft touched down with a jolt that felt symbolic. The landing gear wasn't the only thing locking into place. So were the consequences. Within moments, the aircraft was parked, the seatbelt sign pinged off, and a group of uniformed officers boarded, moving with deliberate calm. The lead officer made eye contact with the air marshal, who nodded. Victoria flinched when she saw them approach. "Wait, this isn't necessary," she began, standing too quickly. "Ma'am, please remain calm," one officer said. "We're asking you to come with us." She looked around for support, but found none. Only silent stares, cold disapproval. The passengers she'd treated as beneath her now watched without pity. From row 2, Donovan rose slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Victoria's face crumpled. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know who he was." "And that's the problem," Donovan said softly, voice cutting through the cabin. "You shouldn't need to know someone's name or bank account to treat them with basic decency." The officers escorted her down the aisle, past the people she'd tried to impress, toward a fate she never imagined when she demanded her extra pillows and special service. Eli watched it all unfold, not with glee, not with vengeance, but with understanding. He didn't want her life to be ruined. He just wanted people like her to stop trying to ruin lives like his. At the gate, media waited. Someone had tipped off the press. Phones captured the arrest. A wave of flashes followed Victoria as she disappeared from view. Donovan and Eli exited last, shielded by security, met by a driver already holding the door open. As they stepped into the sleek black SUV, Donovan turned back toward the terminal. He didn't need to say anything. The message had already landed, not with shouts, but with truth and consequence. Weeks had passed since that flight landed, but the impact had not. What had started as a quiet injustice, hidden in the softness of polite prejudice, had ignited a conversation much louder than any viral video. The clip of Victoria Mercer's outburst, the slap, the public shaming, and the quiet strength of an 8-year-old boy had circulated far beyond social media. It had reached boardrooms, classrooms, and kitchen tables, igniting debates that long needed to happen. And at the heart of it all, Eli Thompson had become a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resilience. But Eli didn't care about being a symbol. He still did his homework every night at the kitchen counter, still brushed his teeth with the same song playing on his iPad, still missed his mom when he saw the stars through his bedroom window. The difference was that the world around him had begun to shift in small but meaningful ways. The airline launched a new See Everyone initiative, a diversity, equity, and empathy training program mandated for all crew members, top to bottom. It wasn't just corporate damage control. Under pressure from both public opinion and a very powerful donor, Donovan Thompson, they committed to a third-party review of their internal policies. Anonymous reporting portals were opened for passengers and staff. The company even partnered with a nonprofit dedicated to eradicating racial bias in travel industries. But Donovan didn't stop there. In the weeks after the incident, he began using his influence in quieter, more targeted ways. Behind the scenes, he convened meetings with airline executives, education leaders, tech CEOs, and legislators. The goal wasn't just to talk about change, it was to fund it, enforce it, and scale it. He donated anonymously to multiple advocacy groups and helped launch a mentorship program for underrepresented youth pursuing aviation careers. For every story like Eli's, there were thousands unheard, unrecorded, unaddressed. He couldn't fix it all, but he could start somewhere. One afternoon, Eli was invited to speak at a youth summit in Washington, D.C., not because of what had happened to him, but because of how he had responded. Dressed in a navy blue suit that matched his quiet confidence, he stood at the podium, gripping the microphone with both hands. "My name is Eli," he began, "and a lot of people know me because of something bad that happened on a plane. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to say this. What someone thinks about you doesn't have to change how you think about yourself. Even when people try to shrink you, you don't have to become smaller." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. And if you're someone who's watched it happen to others and stayed quiet, don't be ashamed. Just speak up next time. Because one voice might not change the world, but it can change the moment someone really needs it. When he stepped down, the crowd didn't erupt. It didn't need to. There was a stillness in the room, a stillness of understanding, of reflection. The kind of silence that comes not from uncertainty, but from knowing something important just happened. Back home, Donovan watched the speech from his office. No press, no cameras. Just a father witnessing his son grow into the kind of person he hoped he'd be. Not hardened by injustice, but shaped by it. Not fueled by rage, but by purpose. It wasn't a revolution that shouted. It didn't come with protest signs or headlines, but it came. quiet, unmistakable, and unstoppable. The kind that begins not in the streets, but in the hearts of people who decide that dignity isn't optional, and justice doesn't need to be loud to be lasting. Sometimes the loudest truths are born in silence. A quiet seat in first class, a whispered insult no one thought would matter, a child absorbing more than just turbulence. Eli Thompson didn't board that plane to make a statement. He simply wanted to see the sky, to feel the magic of flight, to be closer to his dreams. But life, especially for a black child in a world still tangled in prejudice, rarely goes uninterrupted. Eli's story didn't begin with a slap, but that moment became the lightning rod. A slap delivered by a woman who saw his skin before his smile, his presence before his personhood. A slap that echoed far beyond 35,000 feet, captured on a stranger's phone and broadcast to a world still grappling with who it sees as worthy. But what followed was not just outrage, it was reckoning. As the video spread, it wasn't the violence alone that stunned people. It was the grace with which a child carried pain. It was the quiet dignity that stood taller than rage. And perhaps most of all, it was the moment a father stood behind his son, not just to defend him, but to show the world what protection, power, and principled leadership really look like. Donovan Thompson, billionaire and builder, could have easily handled the incident with backroom apologies and legal settlements. Instead, he chose exposure. Not to destroy, but to rebuild. Because Eli wasn't just his son. He was every child ever told they were too much, not enough, or simply out of place. He was a mirror to a system that still makes some seats feel like borrowed spaces. What began as a moment of humiliation became a movement, not just inside courtrooms and headlines, but inside companies, classrooms, and homes. People asked harder questions. Policies changed. Training programs began not as checkboxes, but as cultural shifts. And through it all, Eli kept showing up, not as a victim, but as a voice. At a youth summit, just weeks later, he stood behind a microphone, not with fire, but with honesty. "You don't have to shrink," he said, "even when someone makes you feel small." And in that simple truth, he gave permission to thousands watching to grow anyway, to show up anyway, to belong without asking. So what is the lesson we're meant to carry? It's this: true change doesn't always come in the form of marches or megaphones. Sometimes it walks quietly down an airplane aisle. Sometimes it sits patiently in seat 3A. And sometimes it looks like an 8-year-old boy choosing kindness in the face of cruelty. Prejudice wears many faces. It hides behind smiles. It dresses in suits. It whispers where it once shouted. And if we're not vigilant, we begin to believe that the absence of slurs equals the presence of equality. But Eli's story reminds us that injustice often wears the mask of subtlety, and that silence in its presence is never neutral. It also teaches us something deeper about power. Real power isn't about control. It's about choice. The choice to speak when silence feels safer. The choice to stand beside someone when doing so might cost you. And the choice to use your platform not to protect yourself, but to lift someone else. In your own life, you may never find yourself in first class or on the receiving end of public injustice, but you will find moments, small ones, where the world watches who you choose to be. Will you speak up? Will you step in? Will you let the moment pass? Or will you leave it better than you found it? Eli Thompson is just one boy, but his story, It belongs to all of us because it asks something essential. Are we brave enough to believe in dignity for everyone, even when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unpopular? If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, or if it reminded you of someone you love, don't let it end here. Share it. Start a conversation. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel. Your support gives power to stories that deserve to be heard, stories that challenge us, change us, and help us create a world where justice isn't a surprise, but a standard. We're building a library of truth here. One voice, one video, one moment at a time. Subscribe now, and together, let's keep telling the stories that matter.